So we've arrived at an era in history known as the Progressive Era. And it's the Progressive Era due to all of the different reforms that are going to come about at the local, state, and federal level. Now this phrase, muckrakers, comes from 1906. President Roosevelt used the term, the man with the muck rake, and it referred to a character in John Bunyan's book, Pilgrim's Progress. Some journalists took it personally. It was derogatory because Roosevelt said that these reporters, they have their heads so buried in the dirt and the muck, they can't even see the sunlight. However, the public embraced it as a positive aspect of journalism, because a muckraker is someone who will expose corruption or problems with society in an attempt to correct this ill. Now, you can't address the muckrakers without acknowledging McClure's magazine and the brainchild of S.S. McClure, who was truly a pioneer among editors. At the time that he was building up his editing empire, there were 3 magazines, the big 3 of American literary journals: The Century, Atlantic Monthly, and Harper's Weekly. Neither of these 3 really wanted to rock the boat, so up-and-coming writers had a hard time getting published in any of these papers. The muckrakers aside, McClure is credited with introducing American readers to the authors Robert Louis Stevenson, Rudyard Kipling, J.M. Barrie, and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. And ultimately, his staff of writers will contribute to progressive reforms, and their work coincides with the rise of Theodore Roosevelt. For years at McClure's magazine, Roosevelt would be given advance copies of sweeping exposés and often invited journalists to the White House. His methods were also revolutionary because he paid his writers a yearly salary instead of paying them per article, and he allowed his writers as much time as necessary to complete their work, whether it be months or maybe years. Now, McClure is also known for his eccentricity. He was known to maybe disappear for months at a time and then reemerge with just all of these great new ideas. So a number of these muckrakers do work for McClure's. Ida Tarbell is the first writer to join the staff of McClure's, and that was back when it was just an idea in S.S. McClure's mind. She came from Northwest Pennsylvania, and her father was an independent oil man who had built his family home in Titusville. This is the site of Edwin Drake's first strike. Suddenly, her father and his colleagues discovered that the railroad companies, just like that, had increased the price of shipping petroleum to the East Coast. Eventually, word came out that none other than John D. Rockefeller himself had cut a deal with a few select oil men and the railroad companies to ship their materials at discounted rates. These are known as rebates. Everyone not involved with this group or with this cartel would have to pay a higher rate to make up the difference. Her father was eventually put out of business, and this was highly personal to her. So she wrote an extended expose on Rockefeller and Standard Oil, which was considered to be the mother of all trusts. A few months after that last article came out, A History of the Standard Oil Company was published. So Ida Tarbell is person number 1. Ray Stannard Baker, native of St. Croix, Wisconsin, and he primarily got involved in writing articles about the growing tension between labor and capital. He followed reformer Jacob Coxey and Coxey's Armor on their march to Washington to demand increased public works projects. And he even covered the Pullman strike in 1894. He was also a staff member of McClure's and took extreme offense to Roosevelt's muckraker label. He never spoke with him after that. Baker wrote the book Following the Color Line after he left McClure's, in which he described race relations in the American South in the early 1900s. Now, instead of appealing to the human side of things, or the emotion, like Ida B. Wells, he strove for facts, facts, facts. He wanted to understand the way of life in the South, and his book, Following the Color Line, was viewed as reporting on the problem with really no effort to solve it. So we have Tarbell, we have Baker, we have Lincoln Steffens. He was a police reporter for New York's Evening Post, where he covered the activities of Police Commissioner Roosevelt. At the urging of McClure himself, Steffens spent about 3 years in the major cities of the upper Midwest and, in the East, places like Pittsburgh, Philadelphia. His goal was to examine the ties between political corruption at the city and state level. The end result was a series of articles that was eventually published in a book called The Shame of the Cities. He called on Americans to help end the corruption and take back their government, and he even interviewed Wisconsin Governor Fighting Bob LaFollette, where he tracked LaFollette's progress in trying to outmaneuver the bosses of his own Republican Party to pass meaningful reform legislation. So Tarbell, Baker, and Steffens all worked for McClure. Upton Sinclair did not, but he's still worth mentioning because he was good friends with Baker and Steffens, and The Jungle is really one of the primary examples of muckraker journalism. He set out to write about life as an immigrant and the struggles that immigrants faced. He lived among the immigrant workers in the Stockyard district of Chicago, and he recorded their stories and perceptions. He set his story in that meatpacking district, and The Jungle describes the life of how one immigrant has all of this unbridled optimism towards life, but he gets hurt, is replaced on the job, and he just gets worn down by life. Now, as opposed to focusing on the socialist message at the end of the novel, or the need for perhaps immigration reform, most Americans focused on the appalling conditions at the meatpacking plants. Sinclair actually said, "I aimed for America's heart and I hit them in the stomach." By the time he arrived at the White House for a lunch appointment with Roosevelt, the Department of Agriculture was already sending agents to investigate the conditions from the book. Roosevelt read it, he was appalled, he sought to take action. That's the power that these muckrakers had in the early part of the 20th century.